must be drowned out from memory.
Meanwhile, Avona Bigta beautiful indeed, and his rage blazed with those who knew position in the realm were 7 ministers of Persia and Media: Karshina, Shetar, Amdata, Tarshish, Meres, Marsen, the king's word conveyed to her by the eunuchs. But all the ministers and all the peoples out into their contempt, as they say, King Ahasuerus commanded the Queen Vashti, Persia and Media, if then it so please the king, let the royal declaration be sent. He shall come no more before King Ahasuerus shall be heeded and obeyed. And should please the king and the ministers, each in his script, and the peoples by people, in
Who poisoned now? We will have.
When King Ahasuerus' fury had daily said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out to the imperial city, Shushan, to that in their ointments there. And that is what he did. Exile expelled with Joachim, king of Judah, who was exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, Esther, that is his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother, and the girl was lovely and beautiful when her father and mother had died. Mordecai adopted her as his own child. And when the king's word and his rulings were heard, and vast numbers of young women were gathered into the imperial city Shushan and into the charge of Haggai, Esther, too, was taken to the king's palace into the charge of Haggai, the keeper of the women. And the young women pleased him. The young woman pleased him, and she carried kindness with her. And he hastened to her all the ointments and meals and the 7 young maids to whom she was entitled from the king's palace. And he treated her with a special care, her and her maids, all the time that she was in the harem. Esther, meanwhile, made no mention of her people or her birth. For Mordecai had bid her strictly not to tell. And every single day, Mordecai would walk about the harem courtyard to find out whether Esther was well and what was being done with her. As each young woman's turn would arrive to come before King Ahasuerus, after 12 months following her beauty regimen, for that was how long the days of their ointment lasted, 6 months in myrrh oil, 6 months in perfume and the women's ointments. Then the young woman would come before the king, and all that she asked for would be given to her. To bring her from the harem to the palace of the king, she would go into the evening, and in the morning would return to the harem again in the charge of Jehoahaz, the king's eunuch, keeper of the concubines. And then she would come no more before the king, unless he desired her. And she was called for by name. And when the time came for Esther, daughter of Mordecai's uncle, Ahaziel, who Mordecai had adopted as his own child, came before the king, she did not ask for anything except for what Haggai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, told her to bring. And Esther carried grace in the eyes of all who saw her. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his royal palace in the 10th month, the month of Tevet, that is, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she pleased him and carried grace and kindness with her in his eyes, more so than all of the other virgins. And he placed a royal crown upon her head and made her queen in Vashti's place. And the king made a great feast for all his ministers and courtiers, the feast of Esther. And he granted the provinces a remission of their dues and gifts as great as the king's largesse. The king took the ring from his finger and gave it to, I'm ahead of myself. Let's go to the correct page because that's not where we are. We are further back. As the virgins were gathered for a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gates, and Esther had not told of her birth, or her people, just as Mordecai had bid her. For Esther still heeded Mordecai's words, just as she had when she lived under his care. And as Mordecai sat at the king's gate at this time, the fury engulfed Bigtan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, guards of the threshold, and they plotted to lay their hands upon King Ahasuerus. But Mordecai learned of the plot and conveyed the knowledge to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in Mordecai's name. The matter was investigated and found to be true, and the two men were hung up dead on a post, and the story was written down before the king in the scrolls of the Chronicles.
Well said. Someone stood on their head. They were so impressed with the reading of the Megillah. I'm speechless. And for Winston to be speechless is quite a feat, I assure you. Very well. The next reader in our glorious lineup, the reading of the Megillah, will be Linda.
I'm representing the uncostumed. We may not look fun, but we're just a little more restrained in our fun.
It's all kinds for the world to do.
That's right. Am I good on the mic? Okay. Sometime after this, King Ahasuerus ennobled Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and promoted him to a seat above those of all his fellow ministers. And all the king's courtiers serving at the king's gate would kneel and bow before Haman. For so had the king instructed. But Mordecai would neither kneel nor bow down. And so the king's courtiers would ask Mordecai, as they served at the king's gate, why do you not obey the king's command? When day after day they said this to him, and he took no heed, they reported this to Haman, interested to see whether Mordecai's word would stand, for he had explained that he was a Jew. After that, Haman noticed that Mordecai indeed did not kneel or bow before him, and it filled Haman with rage. It seemed beneath his contempt to lay his hands only on Mordecai, for they had told him who Mordecai's people were. No, Haman's wish, his wish was to wipe out all the Jews, all of Mordecai's people, across all of Ahasuerus' empire. And so in the first month, the month of Nisan, of the 12th year of King Ahasuerus' reign, a poor, lots that is, were drawn before Haman. Day for day and month for month, and fell to the 12th month, the month of Adar. Haman then spoke to King Ahasuerus, there is one people, scattered and dispersed across all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of all the other peoples, and who do not obey the king's own laws. And it is really not worth the king's while to leave them so. If so, it please the king, let it be decreed in writing to destroy them. And I shall weigh out 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of the bureaucrats to be delivered to the king's treasury. The king took the ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is yours, and so is the people. Do with it as you will. The king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month, and they wrote all that Haman commanded the king's viceroys, the administrators of every single province, and the ministers of every single people, to each province in its language, and to each people in its tongue, written in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed with the king's ring. Scrolls were sent out with the runners to all the provinces of the king, ruling that they wipe out, kill, and destroy all the Jews, young and old, children and women alike, all in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, leaving their wealth for plunder. The text of that letter was to lay down law in each and every province, displayed for every people to see, that they should make themselves ready for that day. The runners bolted out at the king's word, and the law was laid down in the imperial city Shushan. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, and the town of Shushan stood aghast in horror.
Next, I would like to call for Barbara.
Mordecai understood that all that had happened, and he tore his clothes and dressed himself in sackcloth and ash, and he walked out across the town crying out a great and bitter cry. He came as far as the entrance to the king's gate, for no one enters the king's gate dressed in sackcloth. And in every single province, wherever the king's word and law extended, deep mourning prevailed among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and grief, the multitudes lying down upon sackcloth and ash. Esther's young maids and her eunuchs came and told of this, and the queen's whole body shook, and she sent clothes for Mordecai to put on, to lay aside the sackcloth that he was wearing. But he would not accept them. So Esther called Hattah, the king's eunuch employed for her service, and she bid him go and speak to Mordecai, and to find out what all this was and why. Hattaka went up to Mordecai, to the town square and before the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and all about the money that Haman had promised to have weighed out to the king's treasure in return for the Jews to destroy them. And he gave the text of the decree that had been issued in Shushan to have them wiped out, telling him to show it to Esther and to speak to her, bidding her strictly to go to the king and plead with him, to entreat with him on her people's behalf. Hattah came and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Esther told Hattah, bidding him repeat it to Mordecai. All the king's courtiers and all the people of his province know that there is only one law for any man or woman who comes before the king into the inner courtyard without being called, to be killed, unless, that is, the king extends his golden scepter toward him, and he live on, and he live on. And as for me, if I have not been called to come before the king these 30 days past, and Mordecai was told what Esther had said. Mordecai sent back reply to Esther. Do not imagine that you can escape to the king's palace from the fate of all the Jews, for if you keep your silence at this time, relief and salvation will come forth for the Jews for some other place, but you and your father's house will be lost forever. And who can say, could it not be for just a time as this that you came into royalty? Esther sent back word to Mordecai. Go gather all the Jews in Shushan and fast for me, and do not eat and do not drink for 3 whole days, day or night, and I and my maids shall fast also. And so shall I come before the king in defiance of the law, and if I'm lost, I am lost. Then Mordecai walked on and did all that Esther had told him.
Now then, let us go on to the end, into the storm and through the storm. Daniela.
I love how you make me Spanish. I love it. On the 3rd day, Esther dressed herself in royalty and came to stand in the inner courtyard of the king's palace, facing the palace, while the king sat upon the royal throne in the great hall, facing the palace entrance. And when the king noticed Queen Esther Standing in the courtyard, she carried grace in his eyes, and the king extended the gold scepter in his hands towards Esther. And Esther came forward and touched the scepter's end. And the king said to her, "What brings you?" "Esther, my queen." "And what would you ask? Be it even half of my kingdom, it shall be yours." Esther said, "If it so please your majesty, may the king come today with Haman to the feast that I have prepared for him." And the king called out, "Hurry, fetch Haman to go carry out Esther's word." The king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And at the drinking feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your desire then? It shall be yours. And what would you ask? Be it even half of my kingdom, it shall be done." So Esther answered and replied, "This is my desire and my request. If I am pleasing to the king, and if it so please the king to grant what I desire, to give me my request, let the king and Haman come again to the feast that I shall prepare for them, and tomorrow I shall do whatever the king asks." Haman went out on that day, happy and buoyant of heart. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and the latter did not stand up and did not tremble at his presence, Haman was filled with rage against Mordecai. Yet Haman restrained himself until he reached his home. And there he sent for all his friends and his wife, Zeresh. And Haman told them of his glorious wealth and the great number of his sons, and all the ways that the king had elevated him and raised him above all the ministers of the courtiers of the king. And finally Haman said, and Esther brought no one else. She brought no one else with the king to her feast but me. And tomorrow too I am invited to her along with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me whenever I see that Jew Mordecai sitting there at the king's gate. Zeresh, his wife, replied with all his friends, "Let a post be erected, full 50 cubits high, and in the morning just say the word to the king, and Mordecai shall be hung up on it. And then you will go happy with the king to the feast." The idea pleased Haman, and he erected the post.
Kaylee, if you please.
The king slept fitfully that night, and he called for the scroll of the records, the chronicles of the realm, to be brought to him, to be read out before the king. There it was written that Mordecai had reported Bigtan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, guards of the threshold, who had planned to lay hands upon King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or greatness has been granted Mordecai for doing this?" And the king's pages, those who were attending him, said, "Nothing has been done for him at all." "Who is in the courtyard?" asked the king. And Haman had come to the outer courtyard of the king's palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the post he had prepared for him. The king's pages said to him, "Ah, there is Haman standing in the courtyard." And the king said, "Show him in." In came Haman, and the king asked him, "What should be done for a man the king wishes to honor?" Said Haman to himself, "Who could the king wish to honor more than me?" So Haman told the king, "The man the king wishes to honor, well, let the clothes of royalty be brought forth. clothes that the king himself has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, with a royal crown placed upon its head. And let these clothes and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's noble ministers, to dress the man whom the king has a wish to honor. And let him lead that man, riding on the horse, across the town square, crying out before him as they go, 'This is what is done for the man the king wishes to honor.' 'Hurry now,' said the king to Haman. 'Take the clothes and the horse, as you have said, and do just that for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gates. Let no detail fall short of what you have described.' So Haman took the clothes and the horse and dressed Mordecai and led him across the town square, crying out before him as they went, 'This is what is done for the man the king wishes to honor.' And then Mordecai returned to the king's gates, and Haman bolted back to his house, grief-stricken, covering his face. Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends all that had happened to him. And his wise men, with his wife Zeresh, said to him, 'If this Mordecai you have begun to fall before is of Jewish blood, you will not overcome him. You must fall before him.' But they were still speaking when the king's eunuchs arrived to fetch Haman with terrible haste to the feast that Esther had prepared."
Time to go. Chapter 7.
So the king and Haman arrived to drink with Queen Esther, and on that second day also at the drinking feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your desire, Esther, my queen? It shall be yours, and what would you ask? Be it even half of my kingdom, it shall be done." And Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor, my king," she said, "and if it so please you, your majesty, let me have my life at my desire, my people at my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be wiped out, killed, and destroyed. Had we but been sold away as slaves and bondwomen, I would have kept my silence, for the anguish is not worth any loss to the king." And King Ahasuerus spoke, and he said to Esther the queen, "Who is this, and where is he? Who has put it into his heart to do such a thing?" "It is a foe, an enemy," said Esther. "This vicious man Haman." And Haman was suddenly terrified before the king and the queen. The king rose up in his fury and left the wine feast for the palace garden. As Haman stood up to entreat for his life with Esther the queen, for he saw that the king was already set upon his downfall. By the time the king came back from the palace garden to the feasting chamber, Haman had thrown himself onto Esther's couch. "What?" said the king. "Would you take the queen too, and with me in the palace?" And the servants stepped forward to cover Haman's face. And one of the eunuchs, Harvona, said to the king, "You know the post Haman prepared for Mordecai, who spoke up well for the king, is standing now in Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him upon it." Thus was Haman hung up on the very post he had prepared for Mordecai. And the king's fury was subsided.
And all the way from the province of Canada, Miss Anne of Green Gables, ladies and gentlemen.
On that day, King Ahasuerus granted Queen Esther the estate of Haman, enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai, came before the king, for Esther had finally revealed what he was to her. The king took off the very ring that he had once given over to Haman and gave it instead to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over Haman's estate. But then Esther spoke to the king again, falling down at his feet, weeping and pleading with him to overturn the wickedness of Haman, the Agagite, and the plot that he had thought up against the Jews. The king extended his golden scepter to Esther, and Esther raised herself up and stood before the king. And she said, "If so it please the king, and if I have his favor, and if it seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let the decree be written to revoke the scrolls that were the plot of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, who wrote to destroy all the Jews that are in all the king's provinces. For how can I live to see the evil that will come upon my people? How can I live to see the loss of those I am born of?" King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai, the Jew, "Look, I have given Haman's house to Esther, and he has been hung up on the post for putting out his hand against the Jews. Now write whatever you like about the Jews in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. But no writing that has been written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's seal can ever be revoked." And so at that time the king's scribes were called, on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, the month of Sivan, that is, and they wrote down all the Mordecai dictated to the Jews and to the viceroys, the administrators, and the ministers of all the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its script and to each people in its language, and to the Jews also in their script and in their language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's seal, and the scrolls were sent with the horseback runners riding the swift horses of the royal stable, young of the royal mares, to the convey that the king had granted the Jews in every single town the right to come together, to stand up and defend their lives, to wipe out, kill, and destroy all the armed hordes of the peoples and provinces who threatened them, even their children and women, and to loot their plunder, all on one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, that is, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. The text of that decree was to lay down law in every single province, displayed for every people to see, that the Jews should make themselves ready for that day to wreak vengeance on their enemies. The runners riding the swift horses of the royal service bolted out at great speed, spurred on at the king's word, and the law was laid down in the imperial city Shushan. So Mordecai left the king's presence in royal clothes of sky blue wool and fine white fabric, wearing a great coronet of gold and a mantle of finest linen and scarlet. And the town of Shushan was filled with jubilation and happiness. And the Jews basket in light and happiness, joy and great honor, and in each and every province, in each and every town, as far as the king's word and law reached, happiness and joy touched the Jews, feasting a holiday. And many of the local people joined with the Jews, for a terror of the Jews had fallen upon them.
We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight them on the landing grounds. We shall fight them in the hills. If we had aeroplanes, we would fight them in the air. We will never surrender. And now, my fellow countryman, Miss Mary Poppins, who is practically perfect in every way.
And on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, when the king's word and his law were to come into effect, on the day when the Jews' enemies had hoped to overcome them, it was all turned over. For the Jews themselves overcame those who hated them. For the Jews came together in their cities throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands upon those who sought their harm, and no man could stand before them, for their terror had fallen upon all the nations. And the ministers of the provinces, the viceroys and the administrators, the bureaucrats of the king's court, and all supported the Jews, for a fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great now in the king's palace, and word of him was spreading to all the provinces. The man, this Mordecai, was becoming ever greater. The Jews dealt all their enemies a terrible blow of sword and of slaughter and of destruction. They did whatever they pleased to those who hated them. And in the imperial city of Shushan, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And they killed Pardashantah and Dalphon and Aspatah and Porata and Adaliah and Aradata and Parmashata and Arisai and Aridai and Vetsata, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, enemy of the Jews, but they did not even touch the plunder. On that same day, the number of those killed in the imperial city Shushan was brought to the king, and the king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed 500 men in the imperial city of Shushan alone, as well as Haman's 10 sons. What must they have done in the rest of the king's provinces? And now what is your desire? It shall be yours. What would you ask further? It shall be done." And Esther said, "If so it please the king, may the Jews of Shushan be granted tomorrow also to do as they did today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hung up on the post." And thus the king commanded. The law was laid down in the imperial city Shushan, and Haman's 10 sons were hung. And the Jews of Shushan gathered on the 14th day of Adar also, and killed 300 men in Shushan, never once touching the plunder. Meanwhile, the rest of the Jews in the king's provinces, having come together and stood up to defend their lives, found rest from their enemies, killing 75,000 of those who hated them, though they did not touch the plunder. That was on the 13th day of the month, and on the 14th they rested, and made it a day of feasting and happiness. And the Jews who were in Shushan came together both on the 13th and on the 14th, and rested on the 15th, and made that a day of feasting and happiness. Thus it came about that provincial Jews living in unwalled towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of happiness, of feasting and festivity, and of sending one another good things to eat. Mordecai wrote all this down and sent scrolls to all the Jews in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, near and far, to establish among them that they should mark the 14th and 15th days of Adar every single year, the days when the Jews rested from their enemies, the month that was turned over for them, from sorrow to happiness, from mourning to celebration, to make them days of feasting and happiness, and for sending one another good things to eat, and giving gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted upon themselves what they had already begun to perform, just as Mordecai had written. For Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had drawn the poor, the lot that is, to consume and to destroy them. And when Esther came before the king, he declared by the scroll that the evil plot of Haman that had hatched against the Jews must come down upon his own head, and he and his sons must be hung up on the post. And so these days were named Purim, after the poor. So, following the words of the letter and what they had seen and what had befallen them, they established and accepted for themselves and for their children and for all who would ever come to join their ranks, never to be neglected, that they keep these 2 days as they are prescribed in their right times every single year. And indeed, these days are remembered and marked in every single generation, family by family, province upon province, town upon town. Nor will these days of Purim ever be neglected by the Jews, nor their memory ever cease to be among their children. And Esther, daughter of Abihail, the queen, together with Mordecai, the Jew, wrote with all their authority for this second letter of Purim to be confirmed. They sent out scrolls to all the Jews across 127 provinces, all of Ahasuerus' realm, words of peace and truth. The scrolls were to confirm these days of Purim in their times, just as Mordecai, the Jew, and Esther, the queen had fixed them. And indeed, as they had all fixed their fast days and entreaties for themselves and for their children. And so Esther's word confirmed this practice of Purim, and it was written down in the scroll. As for King Ahasuerus, do we have a 10th reader?
Yes.
Oh,
I am the 10th reader.
I bow to you.
And the 10th speaker, for that matter, as well. As for King Ahasuerus, he levied a tribute from the people of all the land and of the islands of the sea, and the full account of his authority and might, and all the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king exalted. Are they not already written in the scroll of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai, the Jew, was second in command to King Ahasuerus, and revered too among the Jews, beloved of all the multitudes of his brothers, working for the good of his people, and speaking words of peace for all of his children. And it can be said that without Mordecai and Esther, there would have been no salvation for the Jewish people. We owe them a great debt. In fact, without victory, victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, there would have been no survival for the Jewish people. This was their greatest hour. Completed. Mitzvah. And of course, it's not over. Purim is a time, as we've just read, of great celebration. So just as we did on May the 8th, 1945, we shall have a great celebration after a great victory. We shall have Hamantashen. We shall have a Hamantashen contest and a contest of costumes. And Al has some comments as well. Pay heed.
Okay, Winston. When we originally thought about doing this, we originally came up with 4 categories. Okay, but looking at everybody here today and as much participation as we have, we've expanded the categories. So everybody who got dressed is a winner. You got to know that to begin with. Okay, so what we did was, for the ladies category, because there's so many ladies got dressed up, we're going to do most original Purim contest, most imaginative, most realistic, and best overall. For the male, it's going to be best Purim, best overall, and most original. And for the kids, the teens, best Purim, best overall, and most original. And for the kids, best Purim, best overall, and most original. The winner, the most original, or the best overall, will wind up getting something from Kim. Everybody else who's participating will get a certificate with your name on it and the contest that you won or that you were a winner of. And you'll have it forever. That way everybody's included. So Meredith, David Cook, we need to come up here and do this thing here.
You want to have people come out in the group?
Yeah. What we're going to do is we'll do the kids first. So all the kids that are dressed up need to go into the hallway. Not you, you're a teen. He's a teen.
I'll go back there and organize the children.
He's a teen. Yeah, if you want. Kim, are we going to do walk-in music? We'll get Winston to sing. Give us a British ditty.
A British what?
A British ditty.
A ditty?
Ditty. A British ditty. You can do that. That would be good.
We'll have a barrel of fun.
Okay, so David, you know the categories, right? What? Here. You take these out. Yeah. I don't need them. I know them already. I am.
He's doing.
Yep. I plan on doing that. Thank you, ma'am. Okay, are all the kids ready? What happened to the voice? What happened to my mic? JD, what happened to my mic? There you go. Yeah, when you guys come up, please tell us who you are and what your costume is, and then stay up here. And turn around so that everybody can see you and take pictures. Ladies and gentlemen, our first contestant is Evan. Come on up, Evan. Do your twirl so everybody can see you. There we go. What's your character? What's your character? Ghostbusters, okay. Toastbusters. That's a good one. Come on up and stay here. Stay up here. Okay, next. And you are? Okay, but what's your name? What's your real name? Tiana? Sienna. This is Sienna, and she's a Chinese girl. We don't need to are. Okay, we have our judging. Flew in. Now we have. Okay, then. Go on. Roaring 20. Are you Mutant Ninja Turtle? Are you gonna sing Chin Chin dressed as an Indian lady? I can tell someone used to. Yeah, we need all the. I think we need all the contestants, don't we? We need the ladies first. Male. Yeah. Come on.